So the AMD Radeon RX 7700 XT is finally here, and it's coming in at a bit of a budget price with a bit of a kick, but I'll show you that in this review. Now, based on the questions I'm getting, I'm including a bunch of GPUs that you might have already to make this something that might hit a little more close to home for you. So in this review, aside from the AMD Radeon Sapphire 7700 XT, we're also going to be showing you the EVGA GeForce RTX 3060 XC card. It's still a great card, but it might have some competition. Mind you, I know a few years later, but still. Then I'm going to be showing you the Asus TUF 5700 OC Evo card, and I'm going to be comparing it alongside AMD's own 7900 XT. That way it'll give you a better gauge on what you can expect. Now, to start things off real quick with pricing and everything, the 3060 XC, even though it came out in 2021, today on Amazon, it is worth $574. It's still a great card even for today's standards. Then the 5700 XT is going for $599, even though it came out in 2020 for about $420. That's crazy. And the 7900, it kind of just came out for $899. It's now $849 on Amazon. And obviously it's still a great card. Now, the 7700 XT MSRP'd for, I think it was $499 or $599. Right now on Amazon, you could pick one up for $449. That's pretty awesome. But anyway, without wasting any more time, let's jump into the review. We're gonna start off first on the synthetics with the tried and true 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme. So here we can see right off the bat, the RX 7900 XT takes the cake, but not by a lot. So we can see it comes in on the 3D Mark score, and that's what I'm gonna focus on the most here, at 30,778. That's number one. Then number two on this scale is the 7700 XT at 20,016, a 34.99% lead, just below the 7900. But price comparison, that's where it fits. Now, coming in third, surprisingly, is the 5700 XT at 12,440, 37.85% slower than the 7700 XT. And then at fourth is the 3060, coming at 47.34% slower than the 7700 XT at 10,541 3D marks. So there is a pretty big difference between all four of the cards, and of course the two closest being the 7700 and the 7900. But we saw the prices are all still pretty close. Now let's jump over to Time Spy Extreme. Once again, the 7900 XT takes the cake, but not by much. We can see here on the 3D Mark score, we're coming in at 11,809, and 32% slower is the 7700 XT at 7,944. Now, just below that is the 5700 XT coming in at 4,801, 39.56% slower. And then again, below that is the 3060 XC at 4,521, only 5.83% slower than the 5700 and 43% slower than the 7700 XT. Now, these are just synthetics. Let's jump over to some gaming. Now, on Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which threw me for a loop because they just renamed it and I couldn't find it, I was upset. I thought they canceled it or something. But anyway, Call of Duty Modern Warfare at 4K Ultra on the 7900 XT, we can see 108 frames per second. Just below that is the 7700 XT at 83 frames per second. That's a difference of 23%. That's pretty awesome for the 7700 XT. Now, just below that, extremely below that, is the 5700 XT, coming in at an unplayable 39 frames per second. And hobbling below that is the 3060 XC at 35 frames per second. But wait, there's more. With using DLSS and FSR, we can actually regain some life on these old cards, and on these newer cards throw in a ton more life. Check this out. On the 7900 XT, mind you, we already had an incredibly playable 108 frames per second. Now with FSR, we're coming in at 164 frames per second. Just below that on the 7700 XT, we're at 116 frames per second. We're in the hundreds now. On the 5700 XT, we have 62 frames per second, but DLSS took over here, coming in at 79 frames per second on the 3060 XC. So DLSS took over FSR on the 3060 XC versus the 5700 XT. That's impressive again for these old cards. But anyway, let's move on to 2K. Now on 2K Ultra, much more playable, but both 2K and 4K. The 7900 XT comes in at 179 frames per second. The 7700 XT comes in at 141 frames per second, while the 5700 is playable here at 65 frames per second. And while playable, but maybe a little stuttery, the 3060 comes in at 58 frames per second, just shy of that magical 60 FPS. Now, turning the tables again with DLSS and FSR, top of the tide is the 7900 XT again, coming in at 238 frames per second. Now, pulling up directly behind it is the 7700 XT at 226 frames per second. That's a 5% difference there. That's impressive for a card that's what, $400 cheaper? That's pretty awesome. Then coming after that is the 5700 XT again at 104 frames per second. FSR is doing amazing here. DLSS kind of trailed behind, coming in at 94 frames per second, a 9.62% difference between the 5700 XT. Still decent, but just short. And now finally, at 1080p, we can see the 7900 XT coming in at 229 frames per second. And just below that is the 7700 XT again at 200 frames per second. That's a slightly bigger difference at 12.66%, but still, that's an incredible difference. Now, one thing that I did forget to mention through all of these benchmarks is over on the right, you can see the average and the DLSS/FSR power and temperature differences on these charts. So for example, at the top, we can see the 3060 XC on average heating up to 64 degrees Celsius, with the hotspot coming in at 75 degrees Celsius. Now, at a minimum, it took 156.4 watts. On average, it consumed 300 watts, and at its peak, consumed 341 watts. Now, a note about the cooling. Now, typically I like to keep my house at 63 degrees, but my family's just raised it up to 66, and during this entire review, it's been 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 18.8 degrees Celsius. The cooler you keep your house, or the ambient temperature around your PC, the cooler your PC will be. You have to remember, those fans in the front, in the top, in the rear, in the bottom, sucking in air, whichever fans they may be, they're pulling that cool air out and they're passing that cool air through your PC. So the cooler your house is, or your ambient temperature, the cooler the inside of your PC will be. The hotter your ambient temperature will be, the hotter your PC will be. Makes sense, right? So I'm really not going to go over that in this review, but it's on the screen in case you want to compare it. As always, if you have any questions on it, just ask down below. I reply to everything. But anyway, moving back to Call of Duty at 1080p, we can see the 5700 XT comes in at 94 frames per second, still 100% playable, and the 3060 comes in at 84 frames per second. That's only a 10% difference. That's pretty impressive between those two cards at least. Then throwing in DLSS and FSR, we can see the 7900 XT again took the crown at 242 frames per second, only 1.65% faster than the 7700 XT, coming in at 238 frames per second. About a $300 or $400 price difference between the two cards, and that difference is amazing. Now we're coming up more on a CPU bottleneck here at 1080p, but still the graphics card does its job. Now below that, again coming in at third again, is the 5700 XT at 137 frames per second on FSR, and DLSS coming in at fourth at 123 frames per second. At 1080p here, everything is buttery smooth. Now, because not everybody plays first-person shooters, we have to throw in a racing game. So we're gonna throw in Forza Horizon 5. So at 4K Ultra, we can see the 7900 XT again takes the cake, coming in at 142 frames per second. The 7700 XT comes in at a still incredibly playable 105 frames per second. And the 5700 XT comes in at 66 frames per second, while the 3060 XC comes in at 62 frames per second. Everything here, even though we're at 4K Ultra, is incredibly playable, and that's pretty awesome that the 3060 and the 5700 XT are still playable here at 4K. But Forza 5 seems to be a little lenient on the cards, and that's pretty awesome. Now on FSR, we can see the 7900 XT takes the lead at 185 frames per second, while the 7700 XT comes in at 120 frames per second, a 35% hit there. Then surprisingly, below that, we'll see DLSS on the 3060 come in at 75 frames per second, and dead last here is the 5700 XT at 72 frames per second. Not very far off from the 3060, but still, it was last. Give credit where credit is due. At 2K, we can see the 7900 XT took charge again, coming in at 232 frames per second. That's mind-blowing speed here, but just below that is the 7700 XT coming in at 158 frames per second. Almost 32% slower than the 7900 XT, but both still incredibly playable. Below that, the 5700 XT comes in at 103 frames per second, and dead last is the 3060 at still an incredibly playable 98 frames per second. Now jumping on the FSR bandwagon, we can see the 7900 XT gets a bit of a cap at 234 frames per second, only slightly faster than the regular score the 7900 XT brought on, but still 28% faster than the 7700 XT. And taking the lead again, the 3060 with DLSS comes in at third at 121 frames per second, a 9% lead over the 5700 XT at 110 frames per second. 4K and 2K incredibly playable. Let's see what 1080p can do. At 1080p, we can see the CPU bottleneck right over here. The 7900 XT, both on FSR and regular, comes in at 240 frames per second. And just below that, the 7700 XT comes in at 161 frames per second, and the 3060 XE comes in at 115 frames per second, 28.57% slower than the 7700 XT, but still incredibly playable. And then dead last here is the 5700 XT coming in at 103 frames per second. Mind you, it's only a 10% difference between the 3060, but still, dead last is dead last. Now, on FSR, as I mentioned, the 7900 XT comes in at 240. The 7700 XT comes in at 193 frames per second, a 19.58% difference here. And then DLSS comes out of nowhere, coming in at third at an impressive 158 frames per second, only 18% slower than the 7700 XT. And then again, dead last is the 5700 XT coming in at still an incredibly playable 97 frames per second, which oddly enough was slower than the regular score it provided, but still coming in 38% slower than the 3060 XC. Now, I'm not too much a fan of Forza. The graphics are beautiful and everything, and the soundtrack is awesome, but I'm not a fan of the way it plays. Now, let's jump over to CyberPunk 2077. I love the way that game plays. We'll start off at 4K Ultra. Now here we can see the 7900 XT comes in at 55.36 frames per second. Unplayable. Below that is the 7700 XT coming in at 53 frames per second. That's 3.85% slower than the 7900 XT. Both already unplayable. Next up is the 5700 at 23 frames per second. And dead last is the 3060 at 21.19 frames per second. That's 10% slower than the 5700 XT. Now, let's see if FSR and DLSS can help out here. On the 7900 XT, we can see the card has retaken its crown here, coming in at 103 frames per second. The 7700 XT comes in at a playable 69.98 frames per second, 32% slower than the 7900 XT. Then DLSS comes in at 40.18 frames per second on the 3060 XC. Then dead last is the 5700 XT at 37 frames per second. That's 7% slower than the 3060. And now we have ray tracing to include in these benchmarks. Now on the 7900 XT, we can see the card tried hard coming in at at 49.49 frames per second. Below that is the 7700 XT coming in at 33.55 frames per second, 32% slower than the 7900 XT. Then coming in at third is the 3060 XC coming in at 8.63 frames per second, 74% slower than the 7700 XT. And the 5700 XT is kind of in the corner saying, I didn't want to do ray tracing anyway. Whatever, because it just can't do ray tracing. It's an older card. So let's see how these cards handle 2K Ultra. Now the 7900 XT gets a little more comfortable, coming in at 179 frames per second, while the 7700 XT comes in at 141 frames per second. Both incredibly powerful here. They're running beautifully. Right below that is the 5700 XT coming in at 65 frames per second, and dead last is the 3060 XE coming at 58 frames per second. Almost completely playable at a 10% difference between the 5700 XT. Now on FSR, we can see again the 7900 XT takes the lead, coming in at 238 frames per second, but not very far below that is the 7700 XT coming in at 226 frames per second, only 5% slower than the 7900 XT. That's impressive. Then below that is the 3060 XE using DLSS at 112 frames per second, 50% slower than the 7700 XT, and dead last is the 5700 XT coming in at an incredibly playable 104 frames per second, a 7% difference between the 3060 XE. So still, those two are incredibly decent at 2K. With ray tracing, we can see the 7900 XT comes in at 70.25 frames per second. Very playable. Not in the hundreds, but still over 60 frames per second. So it's running beautiful at 2K with ray tracing ultra. Then coming in behind that is the 7700 XT coming in at 50 frames per second. Not very playable there. And below that, the 3060 XE coming in at 41.83 frames per second. Not playable at all. Fortunately, we have to drop off on the 3060 there. And well, the 5700 is just standing there saying, I can't do ray tracing. It's pretty sad. All right, so at 1080p, we can see the 7900 XT again takes the lead, coming in at 200.67 frames per second. Below that, the 7700 XT comes in at 145.66 frames per second, a 27% difference between the 7900. Below that, we can see the 3060 XE coming in at an incredibly playable 84.30 frames per second, 42% slower than the 7700 XT, but still incredibly playable. And coming in dead last is the 5700 XT coming in at 74.71. Last, but still very playable. And only an 11.38% difference between the 3060 XC. So now with FSR, things change here for the first time. The 7700 XT takes the lead, coming in at 238 frames per second over the 7900 XT's 223.77 frames per second. That's only a 5.98% lead, but still on a cheaper card, lower end card, that 5% means a lot. At third place, we can see the 3060 XE coming in at 118 frames per second, and the 5700 XT coming in at 94.70 frames per second. That's a 20% difference between the 3060. Lower, of course, but still very playable. And now ray tracing, we can see the 7900 XT comes in at 85.53 frames per second, while the 7700 XT comes in at 62.87 frames per second, and the 3060 XE comes in at 53.6 frames per second, and well, the 5700 XT again is in the corner crying, saying, I didn't ask to be here. That's pretty awesome. So we can see the 7900 XT is taking the lead on just about everything here, but price to performance, the 7700 XT takes the cake here. Now, of course, aside from the speed, the 7900 XT takes the cake, coming in with 20 gigs of RAM, while the 7700 XT only has 12 gigs. The 3060 XT as well has 12 gigs, and then the 5700 XT only has 8 gigs of RAM, and we can see in a lot of these tests that actually hurt it more than anything. And well, not having ray tracing doesn't help either, but not everybody uses it, so definitely the card's not out of the picture, and we can see it held its own in a lot of the games. Now, originally I had some more games lined up here, but in the interest of saving time and everything, I had to knock those games out, and I had a ton more tests, but I didn't want to make this a lot longer than it was already. In an upcoming video, I'm going to show you how to install the 7700 XT. Then after that, I'm going to show you gaming on this card. Not with these games, with other games, considerably better games as well, much more popular. So we can see just what this card can provide you. Since this is my largest review, I need your feedback on this. Did you like the way I presented everything? Did I miss something that you wanted? Are there other cards you would have preferred I should have thrown in here? I might still be able to review some more cards. Unfortunately, I believe I'm going to have to return this card soon, so I can't say just yet, but stay tuned for more on that. But I definitely need your feedback on that because we are going to be getting more cards as we grow here, and I want to make sure I can fulfill all of your needs on that. But aside from that, I think the 7700 XT is an amazing card, especially for what it is. These two cards are considerably older than the 7700 XT. This just came out a few days ago. These came out a few years ago, and still some of them are more expensive. The 7900 XT is more expensive, is more powerful, has more RAM as well, but performance-wise, I don't know. I don't think there is such a $300 or $400 difference. I think it should be greater than that. So I think getting the 7700 XT is a steal right now. And the price is only going to go lower. So at $449 currently, that could change at any point. I think this is a steal, an amazing card. This is Iggy with ThisBytesForYou, giving you my full review of the Sapphire Radeon Pulse RX 7700 XT gaming card. A definite win in my book. Iggy out. See you guys.